All right, welcome to Eco Notes number 4. We're going to talk about factors in ecology notes today, also known as line goes up, line goes down. So that's kind of what we're going to be going through today. As always, you're going to need some foldable notes of one sort or another. So make sure that you either have the printer paper set up kind of like this with some colored pens so you can distinguish different things, especially today considering we're going to have different colors of lines that we're tracking and charting. Or if you're just using some kind of a notebook, that's also perfectly fine, perhaps just one page for each slide. With that said, let's go ahead and hop right into it. So we've been talking about a lot of different things regarding the study of the environment. We've talked about organizing everything into different categories of abiotic and biotic factors. We've talked about how we can group those up into the biosphere, which is where all of the life in our known universe exists between the atmosphere and the dirt. We've talked about how those organisms live in different biomes, in different ecosystems where non-living and living things interact. We've talked about how those different ecosystems are made up of several different communities of different things living together and interacting, which are made up of several different populations of species, which are made up of several different organisms. Then we talked about the different relationships that those interacted with each other through, and we talked about how energy flows through those systems. Well, today we're going to look at some of the factors that impact the energy flow, that impact the number of organisms in those areas. Our goal today is going to be to track how populations grow and decline and why. And the reason that we're looking at this is because we are part of these ecosystems. Humans need to know how these ecosystems are working so that not only can we make conditions better for us, but so that we can manipulate, use, and tend to the environment so that they have the longest lifespan possible. First of all, the number one thing that you need to know is the most obvious thing. Whenever an organism has enough food, water, shelter, and mates, it gets to reproduce. You'll remember that there are 3 basic biological goals of life: to eat, grow and metabolize, kind of the same category there, and then to reproduce. So, your very first lesson in ecology factoring is whenever animals or plants or fungi or bacteria have enough food, they get to reproduce, and therefore the population increases and the line goes up. Pretty simple, right? The line's going to go up as the number's increasing. And you guessed it, the inverse is whenever the number of organisms starts to die, the population is going to decrease and the arrow goes down. That's pretty much what we're talking about here in this lesson. Why is this so important? Because these lines tend to have an impact on one another. There's a lot of lines going on at the same time. We saw that in a way with the food web, but we're going to see now is that the number of one type of organism in a community is usually going to directly impact the number of another kind of organism. I'll show you what I mean. There are certain limiting factors, these things that keep populations from growing uncontrollably. Think of it this way. If you had perhaps a small herd of cows, and they had this beautiful infinite grass field, and beautiful sunny days that they got to live throughout, then the number of cows would just grow on and on and on forever. They would eat, they would drink, they would mate, and then you would have a new entire group of cows, and that number would just continue to rise into infinity. Only Earth doesn't work like that. There are a set of factors that we're going to talk about that limit how high these populations can grow. First of all, we need to talk about independent factors of our first of the 2 kinds of factors there are that limit population size. Independent factors are things like climate, the amount of food that's available, and really extreme conditions. Things that are outside of the organism's control. No matter how hard that cow moves, it's not going to change the weather. And the kind of weather in the area is going to determine whether the cows can live there or not, or how long they can thrive. Cows are not going to do a lot of eating and reproducing in the winter months. There's no fresh grass available for them. Usually cows are going to be more dormant in that situation. Also, if there's not a lot of food available, you're not going to have a lot of cows living in that area. And if the entire area burns down in a freakish fire, like a brush fire or a forest fire, then you're just going to have a bunch of roast. You're not going to have any cows at all. So these are independent factors because they are out of the organism's control. However, there are also dependent factors, factors that are dependent on the organisms we're looking at. For example, disease. One of the main reasons that disease is a thing is because when you pack a lot of organisms together, some of the maladies or problems that exist in one organism can sometimes spread to another. Perhaps one type of bacteria or virus that feeds or exploits one host makes it to another, and then to another, and then to another. And as you guys know, if a disease is left unchecked, it can cause drastic, harmful implications to the organism. So, if you crowd more organisms together because they're having lots of babies, then you run a risk of more disease. Also, relationships. Remember that organisms don't like to share space, just like you. I doubt there are many of you who really have enjoyed this time of being inside with your siblings because they're always in your space. People and organisms like to spread out. Therefore, different relationships between organisms are going to limit the factors of how many you can have in an area. You're never going to see 300 lions in a group on the Serengeti in Africa shacking up together. That's not going to be a thing. They're going to want to compete for territory, for food, and for mates, causing them to spread out. If animals are not in the right condition via their relationships to breed, it's just not going to happen. And not only that, we need to look at the second major dependent limiting relationship, which is going to be called predation. Now, we've talked about predation in the last lesson as the idea of a predator and a prey. For example, if we had a certain number of rabbits and a certain number of owls living in, let's say, a wooded area, then the population of the rabbits, the food of the owls, is going to impact how many owls there are, and the number of predators you have, the owls, is going to impact how many rabbits are around. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if the brown line represents the rabbits and the pink line represents the number of owls, then in a normal environmental situation, you'd have two lines that kind of look like this. So this is one of the reasons that you're going to want two different colors for this note-taking series. If you don't have one, just make one of the lines dotted. That said, notice that as the line moves up and down, the other one seems to kind of follow it. So you'll have the brown line kind of go down and then up and then down and then start to go up again. And then you'll have this pink line that represent the owls following it. What's going on here? Well, if we look at this graph in terms of time, like in terms of years, so you have 2003, then 2004, then 2005, and so on, over this period of time, you have the rabbit population start to decrease, and then it starts to increase in 2004 up into 2005, and then it starts to go down again, whereas the number of owls kind of follows and lags behind the rabbits just a little bit. Well, why is this? Well, let's look at several points on the graph, and some of you have figured this out already. It's not the world's most difficult concept. Area number 1, right in the middle of 2003, the owls are decreasing. There's just not a lot of owls in the area. Well, if there's not a lot of owls in the area to eat the rabbits, then that means there's not as many limiting factors keeping the rabbits from growing. And as you guys know, it doesn't take a lot for rabbits to breed. And so the number of rabbits starts to increase, which is what number 2 is. You see in middle of 2004 going into 2005, the number of rabbits is increasing because there's not a lot of owls to eat them. Well, that leads to number 3. If there's more to eat, there's going to be more owls in the area. Either the owls are going to be well fed and they're going to be able to reproduce, or more owls move into the area because they hear the dining experience is just phenomenal. The predator tends to follow the prey. And that's kind of the central idea of predation as a limiting factor. And it pretty much flows in the same way in number 4. The owl number increases. Now there's more predators eating more of the rabbits, which means there's not going to be as many rabbits. So the rabbit line of population starts to go down. That's really the central concept of the idea of a carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is just the range of life an ecosystem can support. So if we continue our lines over from the box to the left, you'll actually see that we have, if we assign some arbitrary numbers here, there is a carrying capacity at work. You'll see this line that the rabbits and the owls don't really cross. That means that as soon as you have a certain number of rabbits, a certain number of owls is going to rise up to meet it and eat the rabbits. And then they'll dip down until the owls no longer have enough food to survive, and so they'll either leave or they'll die. And then once there are less owls, once there are fewer owls, the rabbit number will begin to increase. So in this graph, we could suggest maybe the carrying capacity of this ecosystem is about 500 rabbits and 50 owls. Now you may say, hey, that can't be true. There can't be 500 rabbits and there can't be 50 owls. The lines are the same place on the same graph. Okay, well, yeah, it's a representation. If there were 500 owls in a forest, that would be rather terrifying. So the concept of how many organisms there are in an area is the idea of density. So the density is the amount of organisms per area. So let's take that woods, for instance. For every 500 rabbits, there are about 50 owls. That's the density. Now, you can also describe the density in terms of area. So for every square mile of land in central Indiana, there's an average of 3,000 robins, and there is an average of, something that eats robins, 4,000 falcons. That's way too many falcons, but that's generally the idea. It's just how many organisms per area, usually represented in some kind of a fraction. If it is a less dense area, there's fewer organisms. And if it is a more dense area, there are more organisms in the area. So again, carrying capacity, just the idea of pretty much the maximum amount of organisms that an ecosystem can support steadily. Now, can you have a situation where you have maybe 3,000 rabbits in this woods? There's some kind of freak semi that crashed next to the woods that was carrying a ton of rabbits, and now there's a bunch there. Oh, sure, you could have that situation, but that would be quickly corrected by a larger number of owls, and eventually the natural number of resources in the woods, the food, the grass, the water, the rain, etc., would probably bring the number of rabbits and owls back down to about 500 or 50. Now, all of this to say that that's kind of like a delicate balance that exists in nature. There's this simple, very fragile, kind of resting on the head of a pin that a lot of nature goes through. Everything's been kind of tweaked just right over tens and hundreds of thousands of years of organisms living, hunting, dying, eating, growing, and reproducing. So when humans start to mess with that, whether on purpose or by accident, it can completely wreck things. And this is really the central and core concept of factors in ecology, because one of the most dangerous and potent factors that we can look at is the idea of the invasive species. An invasive species is a non-native organism that impacts the local ecosystem. So there are, again, two major things that you need to get from this. First of all, it's a non-native organism. So it is an organism that is not typically found in that community. There are a couple different definitions. Some people say that an invasive species is something that has to come from perhaps another biome or another continent, whereas some say that it's just from another community. It's just something that's not from around that ecosystem. And it's also going to impact the local ecosystem. So the lilac bush in your grandmother's backyard may be invasive, so to speak, but it's not really impacting the local ecosystem. There are three primary invasive species that I want you to know. There are three examples that everybody should know, at least in my ecological opinion. The first of these is directly impactful to you. It is called the emerald ash borer. The emerald ash borer is an immigrant from Southeast Asia to Indiana, Michigan, and parts of Wisconsin. This interesting little insect, and by interesting I mean absolutely disgusting and terrifying, is this bright green colored beetle that hitched a ride over from some Asian imports to the United States, basically around the 60s and 70s. Only something interesting was found about this beetle's eating habits. It really, really loved Indiana ash trees, hence why it's called the emerald ash borer. It bores into ash trees and eats them from the inside out. And as a result, it ends up killing the ash trees. So, as a result of this emerald ash borer moving into states like Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they have been killing off thousands of local forests full of ash trees, which is causing a lot of ecological problems because there are a lot of specific kinds of birds and insects that nest only in ash trees. Also, ash trees keep a lot of the soil of a certain level of nutrients in the forests they're in the central Midwest, which causes a lot of problems. In fact, it's caused so many problems that it has resulted in huge fines. If you go to a state park in Indiana, Michigan, or Wisconsin, and you chop down some firewood, which used to be a very legal and normal thing to do, now it is illegal to take that firewood out of the forest because it is possible that the firewood you chopped down could contain emerald ash borers and you could be spreading them to other states. They're very interesting quarantine maps. If you've ever been to a local lake or state park, I guarantee you they have posters and signs and bulletin boards filled with keeping the emerald ash borer away, as well as some European mussels, which hitch a ride on boats, but we may get to that another time. The second and really interesting invasive species you need to know is the kudzu vine, which was imported from the South Pacific to Georgia in the mid-1800s. So America was really fascinated with Japan in the middle of the 1800s because the president of the United States, that would be Polk at the time, had just succeeded in opening up the kind of secluded society of Japan for the first time in about 1,000 years. And it was incredible because all of these different things that we were able to learn about this culture and this brilliant group of people who had this amazing understanding of art and culture and science from Dutch studies and similar circumstances. They also had an amazing understanding of botany, including growing vines of all things. In fact, some types of livestock in Japan actually ate this weird type of vine. And it looked really, really cool. Kind of like when you're walking through IKEA for the first time. You're like, wow, a lot of this stuff looks really, really great. I should have some of this stuff. And a lot of southern farmers imported the kudzu vine from Japan and other islands in the South Pacific to their farms to decorate the side of their homes and in some circumstances even to try to feed their cattle. Well, there was a problem. Georgia just happened to be the perfect place for the vine to grow. And much like the emerald ash borer, nothing in the area ate it. There are very few birds, if any, in Indiana that will eat the emerald ash borer. They're disgusting. And there were very few birds or mammals or reptiles or amphibians or bacteria or anything on God's green earth around Georgia that would eat the kudzu vine. And so it would grow and grow and grow. And because there were no limiting factors, it just kept on growing. It would take over entire land masses. This massive sea of twisted, thorny green. And then to this day, in fact, there are still some parts of Georgia that are covered up by this kudzu vine. It's pretty crazy. But I have saved the best for last. The most terrifying, the most evil, the most destructive of invasive species in the entire world, perhaps. The one that has probably resulted in more loss of life of any organism, probably has resulted in the extinction of several species, and has caused an entire government to go to war with it, is the European rabbit. That's right. The European rabbit is one of the most atrocious, hideous, horrific, invasive species ever known to man. And I don't mean the European rabbit as in the fluffy bunnies that are hopping around North America. Actually, I do. Those same European rabbits that are perfectly fine in North America and are perfectly fine in Europe are an absolute destructive force in Australia. Story time. So, at the beginning of the 1900s, there was a great English sport. It was known as the hunt. And every year, around April and through the end of May, gentlemen and their fair wives would deign horses, and they would roam the countryside, following after different game, different types of deer, maybe the occasional fox. And this amazing sport was a blast for them. It was kind of like a mix between I don't even think I have an analogy for this. It was just awesome. It was a lot of fun. And a lot of English people emigrated to Australia in the late 1800s and early 1900s as it was developing as a nation. And so a lot of the upper class said, old bean, what I'd really enjoy is a good hunt like the olden days in England. So they wanted to import some different species to hunt in Australia. So they thought, well, let's get the rabbit out here. And that was perhaps one of the worst mistakes anyone had ever made for the continent of Australia. And I'm going to tell you why. Rabbits in Australia were a very interesting thing because nothing could hunt the rabbit. Nothing had ever seen something like the rabbit in Australia before. There were no types of birds that naturally hunted the rabbit in Australia. There were no types of wolves that had thin enough coats to run around. Dingoes didn't know what to do with them. And so rabbits had a much milder, warmer climate than they even had in Europe. So they could eat and breed year-round, which meant that the population growth for rabbits looked like this. And we're going to talk about what this graph means as well. First of all, you'll notice this little dip. At the very, very beginning, you have this thing called a J-curve because it looks like the letter J. Yeah, that's right, Rhodes scholars. The J-curve means that it took the rabbits just a moment to settle before they shot way up. So when the rabbits first arrived, they weren't exactly acclimated to how Australia's climate worked. So a few populations died. So they ended up kind of struggling for the first few years of their existence in Australia. But then they experienced something called exponential growth. You know exponents, right? The tiny numbers that you write when you mean squared or cubed that you put at the top of maybe X or Y when you're using math. Exponential growth is when the line shoots way, way, way up and it starts to curve steeper and steeper because it's not just a steady rise as we saw early with rabbits and owls in a North American forest. No, these rabbits had nothing to stop them from growing. And so they bred and they bred and they bred some more and they had babies and those babies had babies and the number went from hundreds to millions in just a few years. And it ended up starting to have some pretty terrible effects on different invasive species. The effects of the invasive species ended up causing a lot of problems. Let's take a look at them. First of all, the other herbivores died. Other things that ate the grasses in central and eastern Australia didn't have anything else to eat. The rabbits just ate it first. And so those populations started to decrease exceptionally quickly. What was the next thing that happened? Well, once the rabbits had eaten everything, they died. Rabbits don't have any self-control. They're not like, that's enough for me, thanks. Nope, I told you. Organisms only have 3 goals in life: eat, grow, and reproduce. There is no shut-off button to any one of those 3 things. So the rabbits would just eat and eat and eat and eat until there was no grass left. So huge portions of Australia were basically left to look like this strange, weird steppe desert where there were all of these rotting rabbit corpses lying around. And it was really gross, which pretty much brings us to the end of this lesson with a very important moral of the story down here in box 8. Food, water, and shelter, the main resources that we see in an ecosystem, are limited. There's only a certain amount that come around. And we'll talk about these different cycles in the next section of notes, but it's pretty easy to understand that when it comes to food that's brought in by producers via the sun and water, these things are limited, which means that carrying capacity is a delicate balance. The organisms that exist in those ecosystems are there for a specific reason, and they all have a different role, a niche in that food web. When you bring an invasive species into the equation, it's a major threat to the environment, which is really going to lead to our activities this week. That said, though, this is what I have for this note series. I'll make sure to post things on Google Classroom as they come. This is, of course, where you can find all of the note series. Make sure you're keeping an eye out for open note quizzes, as well as the assignments on Google Classroom as well. And finally, make sure that you're looking on Google Classroom under the materials section or on Canvas for my classroom schedule. I update that for the week each day. Other than that, that's all I have for you guys. Take it easy, and I'll see you soon.